Okay, so we're going to talk about the Canadian immigration process today. I'm going to do a general overview of the process to become a Canadian citizen, and we'll go over a few of the different types of visas that are required on the way. So today's presentation is presented by Calver and Associates. We're a Canadian immigration services firm located in Oshawa, Ontario, Canada. So the basic immigration process is comprised of 3 steps. So you first have your temporary residence, so that includes all of your visas, and these aren't necessarily required for immigration, which is the second step, which is permanent residence. So those are people who, it's kind of like the American green card, you get your PR card for Canada, and this is almost always required for the next step, which is Canadian citizenship. It's important to note that it's not necessary to live here permanently, so you don't need Canadian citizenship to live in Canada permanently. You can just have your permanent residency. Sounds simple, right? Well, not so much. Every year, there are hundreds of thousands of people that want to come to Canada to stay here either temporarily or permanently. So, the Canadian government has to, regulate these, and they do these through restrictions and limits for the type of visas that they issue to people every year wanting to come to Canada. So there are many types of temporary visas, but they all fall into 3 major categories. So we first have visitor visas up here. These don't really help you on the way to immigration, but the government still does regulate these. And then next we have student visas. So these are issued to people studying at what the government calls designated learning institutions. So those are usually public colleges or universities that issue student visas. Well, the government issues student visas to students studying at these institutions. And this helps you on your way to permanent residence. There are also work visas, and I won't go over it now, but there are many types of different work visas in Canada. Some require a second step, which is called the Labour Market Impact Assessment, and there is also some type of work that is allowed without a work visa in Canada, but we'll go over that another day. So those are the 3 types of temporary visas in Canada. And then the second step that we go to is permanent residency. And so there are also many types of permanent residency programs in Canada. And they fall under 2 main categories. So there's the federal PR programs and the provincial nominee programs. So the responsibility for permanent residency programs is divided between the 2 powers, so the federal powers and the provincial powers. So programs, they're under the federal programs, we have economic classes. So you may have heard of the express entry system, including federal skilled workers, Canadian experience class, federal trades class. There's also family sponsorship, so everything that has to do with family sponsorship also falls under these federal powers. And then the provinces have their own nominee programs. They do mirror the federal programs a lot, but they have their own specific programs which change from year to year. And then there are also some different ways towards permanent residency that we haven't talked about, but they're kind of outliers. So if you come as a refugee or asylum seeker, or if you come here on a temporary resident permit, those are also ways to get permanent residency. And then finally, we have Canadian citizenship, which, as I noted earlier, not everyone gets, but most do. So most people get citizenship this way, which is the application for citizenship based on time. So depending which government is in power, it usually takes about 3 or 4 years to apply for citizenship. You have to also write the citizenship exam and prove that you know English or French through either a test or proof of your education. And then you write the exam, between certain ages, and then after that you are granted your Canadian citizenship certificate, which allows you to get a Canadian passport. The other way is an application for citizenship based on family. So if you're born to a Canadian parent, you can also apply directly for citizenship. You don't have to go through the grant process. Or if a child is adopted by a Canadian parent, they can also apply directly for citizenship. They don't need to go through the entire permanent residency waiting process. So, the reality of the Canadian immigration process, as you can see, is quite complicated, and it also is affected by various factors. A few of them I've listed here, but there are more. So, the location of the applicant. So, different visa offices are responsible for different types of visas, so that can affect the times and what's required of the applicant, depending on where they are. They also might need to provide fingerprints or a medical exam depending on where they live. Inadmissibility issues are also a big factor. So there are criminality issues that can affect a person's admissibility to Canada. There's also medical admissibility. If they have any health concerns, they may also not be admissible to Canada. And lastly, financial inadmissibility. You do have to show that you have enough money in most cases to come to Canada in order to get a temporary or permanent visa. And lastly, I think this is the biggest factor that affects the process is government policy. So both the federal and provincial governments I talked about earlier, that will affect the different programs that exist, processing times, how many people they're letting in each year. So that really affects how many people and how they come into Canada each year. So, lastly, it's why hire a professional to help with your application. So, we're a professional immigration firm and we help people navigate this, as you can see, very complicated process. So, it saves you time and money. Registered Canadian immigration consultants are educated and informed. We've spent years studying and working in this field, so we understand the different nuances and programs that exist. We're also insured, so we protect you financially with our insurance against any errors in an application. We're also required to follow strict ethical guidelines when submitting applications. And lastly, as I said, we're very experienced in the field, so we get it right the first time. So you never have to worry about, a program closing when you're not following policy or a returned application. And that's all for now. We'll look into some of these programs a little bit more in depth next time, but this is the general Canadian immigration process as a whole. Thanks very much.